Hey everyone, I'm back making a video. It's kind of a spur of the moment thing today. I wasn't planning on making a video of any kind, but I had some records in my hands and it seemed like the right time to do it. So here I am. I think most YouTubers probably have quite a agenda and a plan when it comes to making these videos. Not I. I really don't have much of a plan at all. I just grab records and get inspired, and all of a sudden it's time to talk about them. So today I'm going to talk about the Happy Mondays. And as I grabbed all these records out of my boxes here, it dawned on me that I really only have one album of theirs that I love. The rest of their records are of lesser quality, in my opinion. Some of them better than others, but I've never really loved any Happy Mondays record other than this one. Their first album came out in 1987, and let's see if I can remember this title because it's an epic title. It's Squirrel and G-Man, 24-Hour Party People, Plastic Face Can't Smile, Whiteout. I think that's what it is. Whiteout in parentheses. That came out in 1987, produced by John Cale. I'm not going to explain who John Cale is. You should know who he is. If you don't know who he is, go look him up. You probably know who he is, even if you don't know who he is. You've heard his stuff somewhere. John Cale produced it. It's a good album. In fact, I might rate that as my second favorite album from the Happy Mondays. Their first and second albums are on par with each other in some ways, but the first album is pretty good, not perfect. The second album came out in 1988. That was called Bummed, the much more, economically titled album. Bummed came out in 1988, produced by Martin Hannett. Again, I'm not going to explain who Martin Hannett is. If you don't know who he is, go look him up. Again, if you haven't ever heard of him, I have a feeling you probably know who he is. He produced Joy Division and New Order, and he was a factory guy. Happy Mondays were on Factory Records. I'm sure most of you know this. Bummed came out in 1988. Really good album, not perfect. It yielded some really good singles, some excellent remixes. Maybe I'll talk about Bummed at some point in the future. One of my all-time favorite remixes is the Vince Clarke mix of Wrote for Luck. Wrote for Luck, the album version of Wrote for Luck is very good. The Vince Clarke mix is on a different level. It is so good. Again, I love remixes, and I've heard thousands of them over the years, and the Vince Clarke remix of that track might be in my top 10. Absolutely amazing remix. Vince Clarke of Erasure and Depeche Mode, if you don't know. Anyway, Bum came out. Good album, not great. Their third album came out, and you know how sometimes when people ask you what's your favorite album of all time or what's your favorite movie of all time, your mind trails to one record or maybe a handful, maybe 4 or 5. Same with movies. You think of your favorite movie and you're like, okay, that one, I don't know that I could go much longer in my life without having that movie or record close to my side. This is one of those records. That would be Pills and Thrills and Bellyaches. And yes, I have 3 copies of this record, and I will explain why. One of the reasons why it's fun for me to talk about this album is that it is amazing. It is one of the few perfect records in history, and I'll try to explain why I think that. But also, it's got an interesting history in terms of its cover. They got into some trouble with their cover and had to release different versions of it in different countries and so on. But yes, Pills and Thrills and Bellyaches. There are very few records, albums in history, in my opinion, that are perfect from start to finish. Pills and Thrills and Bellyaches is one of those times. And I think there are several reasons why. And I'll try to explain those. But on the surface, this album is absolutely perfect. From the songwriting to the production to the delivery to the emotion, to the soul, to the packaging. It is a glorious ride, and it hasn't aged a day. This came out in the fall of 1990, and you have to picture that time. In the 80s, post-punk had kind of already tired itself out. New wave was getting stale. Indie rock was starting to become more of a thing. They were starting to figure out, bands were starting to figure out how to incorporate some technology into their music. The indie bands were starting to experiment. The technology was getting more affordable. That's a big one. In the 70s and early 80s, for the most part, this technology, when I say technology, I mean synthesizers and drum machines and samplers. These things were very expensive and not everybody could get their hands on them. But as the 80s waned, more people were getting these pieces of technology because they had the money, they could afford to do it. And albums started popping up, like these bands who were previously known as these indie bands. They started creating these indie records, but with electronic influences and dance influences and disco influences. The crossover was starting. And this is, to me, this is the greatest album of all time in terms of bridging that gap between indie rock and dance culture. This is it. This is the king of all. This is the king and queen of all records when it comes to the crossover. The indie meets dance. That term indie dance, it didn't really exist prior to this. Maybe in some circles it did, but it wasn't a big household, name drop thing like it has been for the past 30 years. This record, in my opinion, is the watershed moment in terms of taking punk and marrying it to the punky energy of disco and techno and house and dance culture. It's a perfect album in every way. When I say that, there's one interesting thing about the Happy Mondays in their albums. And they always brought in a different producer for every album. Squirrel and G-Man had John Cole. Bummed had Martin Hannett. Yes Please had Tina Weymouth and Chris France from the Talking Heads. I will not be talking about that album. I don't care how much of a Happy Mondays fan you are. That album sucks. It sucked then. It sucks now. It's horrible, shitty album. Some of the singles that came from that album spawned some interesting mixes and B-sides, but the reason those B-sides were good, Staying Alive and Big Baby Head, was because they were produced by the man who produced this record, Paul Oakenfold. And now I know when I say Paul Oakenfold, you think, wow, he's like the trance douche extraordinaire, right? Yes, he is. He is the trance douche extraordinaire. But there was a time that he wasn't. And this is the shining example of the time that he wasn't. You'll listen to this and you probably, maybe younger people who know Paul Oakenfold and what he typically does, you won't believe this is a Paul Oakenfold record, but it is. And I think in a huge way, this record sounds the way it does because of him. Happy Mondays, they always wrote catchy tunes, but I think they were on top of their game in terms of writing songs. And then Paul Oakenfold was hungry to impress. And he just produced a flawless experience with this record. From the very first song, Kinky Groovy Afro, to the very last song, Holiday. Or is it Harmony? Harmony. Holiday and Harmony are kind of the same song. They kind of bleed into one another at the end. From the first note to the last, it is a smorgasbord of dance, rock, disco, punk, psychedelic, jam rock. If there's a genre of music you like, it's on this record. And it's done flawlessly. Everything is mashed up into this stew. It's produced by this dance DJ producer. And instruments performed and vocals performed by this dirty little bunch of white dudes from Manchester, England. When I say that lovingly. I mean, we're talking about Sean Ryder and Bez and these street kids, essentially. They came from the street. And they just had a lot of enthusiasm and they knew how to write some tunes. And Oakenfold took that energy and condensed it into this. It is, like I said, it is a classic example of all genres being mixed into one fluid, flawless experience. There isn't a single bad track on this album. Every song is stellar. Every song does a perfect job of like bleeding into the next. It flows perfectly. It's a great sunny day album. Like and on the cloudy days, it's a great album to cheer you up. It is flawless. Really beautiful statement from one of the most influential English bands of the 80s. And this album is the reason why. Again, I don't think they ever touched the brilliance of this record on any of their other albums. It just didn't happen. I think another thing that worked with this album is that it came out in 1990 when rave culture was first starting. The year previously, they had released the Rave On EPs, the Weatherall mix of Hallelujah, and Oakenfold was in on that mix too. That was a huge watershed moment as well in terms of bridging the gap between indie music and dance music. In fact, it was really that Weatherall Oakenfold remix of Hallelujah that bridged the gap in a huge way. It put Happy Mondays squarely on the map. It definitely put Andy Weatherall on the map. And I think in a lot of ways, because of the strength of that remix, they brought Oakenfold in to do the Pills and Thrills album. And it was a great choice. Again, let me emphasize again that at the end of the 80s, indie rock was getting a little stale. It was getting a little tiresome. People were trying to find that new hook. And the new hook was dance culture. Rave culture started in the late 80s. And that's basically what the Happy Mondays did with this album. They took that rave energy and just mixed it right in there. It is a perfect album. And every time somebody asks me what my favorite album is, my mind immediately goes to this. There are a few others it goes to, but I can't think of another album that I've listened to more in the last 30 plus years since I've had this very record. This record has changed the way I look at music. It's changed the way I listen to music. It's changed the attitude I have when I approach music. This album is one of the most important pieces of my life in terms of art, in terms of how I view art. If you haven't heard this record, drop everything and just start digging into this. And if you have heard this record, listen to it again, okay? Because albums don't get much more perfect than this. The album starts off with Kinky Afro, which is a rock song. I'm going to see if I can remember all the songs in order. I've heard this so many times. Then it goes into God's Cop, which is like this down-tempo kind of funk groove. The drums are really strong and tight. It's just a fun song. It's rocky, but it's funky. It just bleeds perfectly in from the song that's before it. After that is Donovan, I believe. No, is it Grandbag's Funeral? See, I can't remember those as much as I've heard this record. Let's see here. Donovan. I had that right. Donovan is the third track. Then we have Grandbag's Funeral. That is the fourth track. Then Loose Fit. Loose Fit ends the side one. Side two begins with Dennis and Lois, followed by Bob's Your Uncle, then Step On, then Holiday, then Harmony. Yes, I got those 2 3-syllabled H words in the right order. Holiday and Harmony. All the songs, again, it's weird how the album can up its energy. Each song it gets more energetic and more energetic, and it just keeps building and building and building. Then the last song, it just trails off into this almost psych rocky jam band type groove. It's I hate jam rock. I fucking can't stand it. But Happy Mondays make it work. I think because of everything that came before it, it just works in this instance. A perfect album. I'll stop rambling about how perfect I think it is, but again, if you haven't heard Pills and Thrills and Bellyaches, for God's sakes, treat yourself to one of the great rock, dance, whatever albums. Forget about all the genre tags. It's just a brilliant album. Most inspired, well-delivered, well-executed, energetic, fucking awesome album of all time. Right here, baby. And listen, I listen to mostly electronic stuff. In the 90s, I was listening to you know, mainly electronic music. Warp Records was a huge label for me. I loved LFO and Autechre and Aphex Twin and all that kinds of stuff, all that kind of stuff at the time. And this is still one of my favorites. I think why I like music like Aphex Twin and Autechre and stuff like that is that it has an energy. It's raw. It's honest. Comes from a real place. To me, that's the only thing that matters in music. That's why I listen to jazz and punk and classical and disco and punk and rock, and I don't care. As long as I feel like it comes from an innocent, secure place, or even insecure place, as long as it's honest, that's all I really care about. And this album is honest, baby. Sean Ryder is talking about, like, the lyrics for Bob's Your Uncle. That song is basically about Sean Ryder getting a blowjob, essentially. He talks about, what's the lyric? Three in a bed, two giving head, one getting wet. Oh, one of my favorite, what is it? Grandbag's Funeral has a lyric, the sun shines so brightly from my asshole today. Listen, in the hands of a lesser singer, that would be ridiculous, but it's Sean Ryder. Somehow he makes it work. It's hilarious. And you don't even notice it. You're not even, the song is so good that you don't notice the lyric you just heard is horrible. I think that was Tony Wilson's point about Sean Ryder, is he made you forget about those things because the music was so good. You're too busy focusing how great the vibe was. You didn't have time to focus on the goofy lyrics because it all just meshed together so well. Anyway, genius record. Get on it if you haven't heard it. Now, I'm going to talk about the covers here. It's kind of fun to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about the singles that came from it. Now, this is the original pressing on Factory. You'll see there's a lot of candy wrapper images here. You have Milky Way, you have Kool-Aid, whatever Jumbo is. I don't know what that is. Someone maybe could tell me what that is. Made in good old U.S. You have Necco here, which is like a little flavored wafer candy here in the U.S. Bubble tape. You flip it over, you got some more. Let's see if I can. Here's Kool-Aid again. Anyway, you have various candy wrapper images on the cover here. Now, who was it? Nabisco? I don't know. Whoever candy manufacturer this was didn't approve of this. They didn't like this. And this initial pressing got deleted. So if you ever find this copy with this cover, a good way to tell is this made in good old US, because the covers all look kind of similar. But if you ever see this copy with these wrappers on it, pick it up because it's hard to find. It's not easy to. I've never seen another copy. I bought this new at the time. Never seen another one like it. I think it was quickly deleted. And I'll show off the inner sleeve here too, and the label, because I think it's interesting in terms of how everything changed in later pressings. This is the inner sleeve, track listing. Again, Naked Woman here. If you have the Bummed album, you know that Happy Mondays had a thing for naked women on their inner sleeve. It's much more graphic on the Bummed inner sleeve, by the way. It's just full nude, bush and tits. You get to see it all. Hey, they loved women. Who doesn't love women? And then you have the full production credits here. Actually, no, wait, no. There's no bush. Wow, I'm really getting into the proverbial weeds now. But yeah, she was shaved. All right, I'm getting creepy now. I'm going to let that one go. Anyway, that's the inner sleeve. This is the label. And again, this is different on later pressings. This is the label for side A. We can see that. And then you've got the label for side B. Now these would change. I'll try to hold these up. Try not to confuse them when I'm putting them back together. Anyway, that was the original pressing. This is the second pressing. The second UK pressing on Factory Records. Now you'll notice, I'll hold these up together. You'll notice some differences. Or at least I hope you do. you'll notice that there's some more vague artwork on the repress. The Made in Good Old US and Kool-Aid and all the candy wrappers are essentially gone here. I think they both, yeah, all covers have a green highlighting on them. The back covers have blue highlighting on them. But yeah, you'll notice that the candy wrapper images are gone. And then the back cover also is different. So they got in hot water. They had to change things up. I hope you can see this. You definitely see some differences here. Also, let me pull this inner sleeve out here. It's the same inner sleeve, same naked woman. You'll notice though, hopefully, and I'll actually, let me show this. Here's the original issue. Let me get this in a place where I can show it. Then here's the repress. So you'll notice some differences with the labels, hopefully. There's that one. There's that one. So again, they took a lot of the candy wrapper images off of the represses as well. And you know, in my opinion, this repress is just kind of more bland. It's doesn't pop like the original one does. It just doesn't have that. You know, this one's just so much more colorful and so much more energetic. And then this one's kind of bland. But what are you gonna do? They got sued. It sucks, but there you go. Now this is the US edition. Now this, as you see, is different than the repress on first glance, but it's actually the same as the back cover of the UK repress. But this has green lettering. The back of this has blue lettering. So once again, the US press has the same as the UK repress, but with different shading on the lettering. Now why they did that, I assume they wanted the green shade on the cover and the blue on the back. For whatever reason, the US edition chose to have the back cover of the UK repress as their cover with the green shading instead of the blue. And the back cover of the US edition is this boring, no images at all, and a boring ass paper inner sleeve with a boring Elektra track listing. Elektra did this for all their records for the most part. They just gave you the old Elektra label. So it's interesting how they chose to differentiate the covers and the labels. And this US edition also, those of you who remember the Columbia House Music Club in the 80s, this was a Columbia House Music exclusive. In fact, on the back here, it says, this album, previously available on compact disc and cassette only, is now available in this record version as a special service to Columbia House members. Basically, in the 80s, you would send away, you would get promised 7 or 8 free records, and then you had to stay in the club for a year, and you had to order one record a month, at least one record a month. And if you didn't order one, they'd send one to you. It would be the album of the month. And as cool as it was getting the 7 or 8 freebies at the beginning, what sucked is they would charge you like 18, 19 bucks for every record you ordered every month after that. So it kind of caught up to you, because records back in the 80s were only $7, $8, $9 to buy for an album. So you got the freebies at first, but then they charged you double for every record you were required to buy the rest of the year. So it kind of evened out. You got your freebies, but not really. It was fun. Most of us just got the freebies and then never ordered anything again, and then canceled the membership because we're cheap. We're kids. I mean, you know, what are you going to do? And they let us do it. I think they would let you cancel. I don't know. If someone was around and ordering from the Columbia House Music Club in the 80s, let me know. Anyway, this got released just for that club. This is when vinyl just started being phased out in the United States. It never phased out in Europe. I try to explain this to people. People always come up to me now and they know I'm a DJ and they know I buy records, and they say things like, oh yeah, records are making a big comeback. Now, No, they've always been here. Yes, they're more popular now than they have been in previous, the last 20 years, but they never went away, especially in Europe. If you're a European, you know that vinyl has always been there. It never went away. In the United States, it went away for a couple years. But those savvy buyers like myself in the 90s, we barely bought US records anyway. The majority of my records are probably all from Europe, at least from the 90s. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the singles here quickly. But anyway, these are the differences between the three. I'll show them all. Wait, what am I doing here? Here's the cover. Original. UK repress a year later. US edition. Columbia House. 3 different covers. Interesting stuff. Okay. This was the first single from the album. I've got the boring US promo. This did come out with a picture sleeve. This is the promo on Elektra, just a stickered sleeve. This has 4 mixes of Step On. The Step On is an old John Congus track. They covered it. The 4 mixes here are all by Paul Oakenfold, and frankly, they don't sound much different at all than the album version. They're all very samey. Some of them focus on the drums, some of them focus on the vocals. They're all slightly different, but the remixes here, they never were that different than the album version. In fact, I remember at the time when Pills and Thrills came out, my one complaint about it at the time was the inclusion of Step On, because Step On had been released months before the album, so everyone knew it. So when Pills and Thrills dropped, it was exciting because all these new songs were so great. And then toward the end, Step On came on. And it sort of dragged the album down, for me at least at the time. It just felt like we've got this whole album of new material that's so good. And then here's Step On, which we've all heard for the previous 9 months since it was released. I always thought that was a weird choice. I never liked that choice. But now that I'm more separated from the album, from its release date, it's 30 years later now. When I listen to it now, it makes sense. Step On should be where it is. It makes sense. But yeah, at the time, it just felt like they were rehashing songs. And factory bands were really good about that, like New Order and Joy Division, for example. When they released a single, they never put it on the albums. I mean, not never. They did a few times. But if they did, it would be a different version or a remixed form. Anyway, I always thought that Step On at the time, it shouldn't have been on the album, but now I think it fits. Anyway, this is the Kinky Afro 12-inch. Of all the 12 inches that came out for the album, this is the only one I'd recommend getting. As great as the album is, the singles weren't great. None of them had any B-sides. The remixes were meh. This is the only one I'd get because it has a slightly extended version of the album version. The album version of Kinky Afro is like 4 minutes. It's 5 minutes here. It's basically the album version, but it has an extra minute on there. And I think it's worth it. Like when I've ripped all these records, and when I do my own little version track listing of the album, I put this as the version I put on the album. It should have been the album. It should have been the album version, in my opinion. And the B-side has a live version of Kinky Afro, which is okay. Those of you who have ever heard a Happy Mondays live recording, you'll know that they were not the greatest live band. I mean, they were in terms of energy and presence, but musically, yeah. Again, my opinion, but I've never heard a good live Happy Mondays album. I think you had to see them live, which I never did. I wish I had the opportunity to, but I just never saw them live. This is the remix for Kinky Afro. This, by the way, is a US 12-inch, United States. This is a European promo on London Records. It basically has the live version again, and it has a Peter Lorimer remix of Kinky Afro, which is okay. I haven't listened to it many times in my life. It's all right. Peter Lorimer was one of those guys who, he was one of those guys a record company called when they needed a remix in a fix. Like if they needed a remix quickly, they would call up people like Justin Strauss and Shep Pettibone and Peter Lorimer. There were this group of guys. They kind of worked for the studios and they just did remixes. Artists didn't choose them. They just needed, the record company needed a single. They needed it quick. They tapped a remixer on the shoulder like Peter Lorimer and they did it. So this has got the Peter Lorimer remix on it. Not great. It's not terrible. Kinky Afro isn't really a song you remix. It's a tough one to remix, I think. He gave it a valiant effort and did a decent job. This is a pretty decent single too. This is Loose Fit. This has Oakenfold remixes of Loose Fit and Bob's Your Uncle. The Loose Fit mix isn't that different. Yeah, it's I'm trying to remember this. It's slightly extended and a little more dancey. The best remix on that came from this album is the Oakenfold remix of Bob's Your Uncle. It kind of starts off just like the album version, but then the last few minutes he turns it into this down-tempo, four-to-the-floor kind of like a house thing, like a progressive house mix. More along the lines of what Oakenfold was doing otherwise then. His mix of Bob's Your Uncle is the best mix that came from this album, in my opinion. And then this is the remix edition of Loose Fit. They called it Loose Fix. It's got basically 2 grid remixes of Loose Fit and Bob's Your Uncle. They renamed the grid remix Bob's Your Tune. The grid was Dave Ball from Soft Cell and Richard Norris, who was around in the 80s. He dabbled in a lot of acid house and industrial sounds. He's still around. The Grid had some hits in the early 90s. They were more of like a pop group. Their big singles were like Swamp Thing, Texas Cowboys, Crystal Clear, which had some great Orb remixes, Heartbeat, which had some great Brian Eno mixes. So they produced their pop music, but it definitely was underground enough where it had like a cutting edge house techno sound to it. And they brought in some great remixers. But anyway, this is the Grid Remix EP. Not essential. Not their best, not some of their greatest remixes here. Again, if I would recommend getting this for the Oakenfold mix of Bob's Your Uncle, and definitely recommend this for the full version of Kinky Afro. And so that's my spiel on this album. Again, this is arguably my favorite record of all time. It always brings me up if I'm in a bad place. It brings me up even higher if I'm in a good place. It's just a perfect album. Think about it. How many times in your life do you get to hear perfect albums? It doesn't happen very often, right? It's here. If you like dance music, it's here. If you like rave culture, it's here. If you like rock and punk and post-punk, it's all here. If you like psych rock and jam rock, it's here too. It's all here. And with some of the funniest lyrics you'll ever hear. And again, like I mentioned before, Sean Ryder singing about blowjobs and assholes, it is what it is. You'd think it would stand out though, but it doesn't. It just blends right into the woodwork on this album. A really beautiful testament of how all genres, all forms, all personalities, all energies can come together and coalesce into a big, happy stew. Right here, baby. Again, if you haven't heard this record, go do yourself a favor and listen to it. All right, thank you. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.